I've always loved hiking, especially in the fall when the leaves turn vibrant shades of red and gold. Last weekend, I decided to tackle a new trail in the Adirondacks. It was supposed to be a moderate 6-hour hike, perfect for a crisp October day. I packed my backpack with trail mix, water, and a first aid kit, then hit the road early Saturday morning. The trailhead was tucked away off a winding mountain road. As I pulled into the small gravel parking lot, I noticed only one other car, an old blue pickup truck. I figured it'd have some peace and quiet on the trail, which was fine by me. I double-checked my supplies, laced up my boots, and set off into the woods. The first couple of hours were breathtaking. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The air was crisp and filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. I snapped photos of particularly stunning vistas, thinking I'd share them on Instagram later. I passed a few landmarks mentioned in the trail guide: a gurgling stream, a oddly shaped boulder, and a grove of ancient hemlocks. Everything seemed picture perfect. If only I'd known then how quickly things would change. About 3 hours into the hike, I started to notice something odd. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on what was bothering me. Then it hit me. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No bird song, no rustling leaves, not even the buzz of insects. It was as if someone had hit the mute button on nature itself. I paused, taking a swig from my water bottle and straining my ears. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping sound coming from deeper in the woods. It was too regular to be an animal, but too muffled to make out clearly. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped off the trail to investigate. As I moved closer, the sound grew louder. It reminded me of a drum, or maybe someone chopping wood. But who would be out here, this far from any roads or campsites? The hairs on the back of my neck started to prickle. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. I held my breath, heart pounding. Then, from much closer than I expected, came a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl that was definitely not human. I spun around, ready to sprint back to the safety of the trail. But in my haste to investigate the strange noise, I'd lost track of which direction it'd come from. The trees all looked the same, their trunks slurring together in a maze of bark and shadows. Panic started to set in. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use the GPS, but of course there was no signal this deep in the woods. The trail map in my backpack was useless without knowing my current location. I tried to stay calm, remembering the survival tips I'd learned in Boy Scouts years ago. I picked a direction that seemed right and started walking, searching for any sign of the trail. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every rustle and snap made me jump. As the afternoon wore on, exhaustion and fear began to take their toll. I was getting dangerously low on water, and the temperature was dropping. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was hopelessly lost in a vast wilderness, and night was coming. Just as despair was about to overwhelm me, I spotted something through the trees, a clearing up ahead. Relief washed over me. Maybe it was a campsite or ranger station where I could get help. I quickened my pace, pushing through the underbrush. What I found stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a small clearing, all right, but no cheerful campfire awaited me. Instead, the space was dominated by a crude structure made of branches and animal hides stretched over a frame of bleached bones. Scattered around it were strange symbols carved into tree trunks and rocks. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of Native American site? But it looked far too fresh, the hide still oozing a foul smell. As I edged closer, I noticed dark stains on the ground that looked horribly like dried blood. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I'd stumbled upon something I was never meant to see. Whatever built this place was clearly dangerous and might still be nearby. I had to get out of here, fast. As I turned to flee the clearing, movement caught my eye. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, so still it almost missed it. My heart nearly stopped as I took in the sight. It was human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed slightly too long. It wore what looked like a deer skull as a mask, antlers silhouetted against the darkening sky. The rest of its body was covered in a patchwork of animal furs and forest debris. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt its gaze boring into me. For a moment, we both stood frozen. Then it took a halting step forward, moving with an unnatural, jerky gait. A sound emerged from behind the skull mask. Not quite speech, but a series of clicks and growls that made my skin crawl. Terror finally broke my paralysis. I bolted, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, but I didn't dare look back. The only thought in my mind was to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. Finally, I collapsed against a tree, gulping air and fighting the urge to vomit. As my racing pulse began to slow, I strained my ears for any sign of pursuit. The forest was quiet again, but not the peaceful quiet of before. This silence felt oppressive, watchful. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Maybe it was just a hunter in strange camouflage. Or maybe exhaustion and dehydration were making me hallucinate. But deep down, I knew what I'd witnessed was all too real. As I caught my breath, paranoia set in. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The wind through the leaves sounded like whispered voices. I felt exposed, vulnerable. What if there were more of those things out there? What if they were hunting me? I needed to find help, but I was more lost than ever. The sun was sinking lower, painting the sky in reds and purples. Soon it would be dark, and I'd be trapped in this nightmare forest with God knows what lurking in the shadows. With trembling hands, I dug through my backpack for anything useful. My flashlight provided some comfort, but its beam seemed feeble against the growing darkness. I found an emergency whistle and blew it repeatedly, hoping against hope that someone would hear. The only response was the echo of my own desperation bouncing back from the uncaring trees. As dusk deepened into true night, the forest transformed. Familiar shapes became alien and threatening. Every rustle and snap made me flinch. I knew staying put was dangerous, but wandering in the dark seemed even worse. I wedged myself between the roots of a massive oak, trying to make myself as small as possible. The cold began to seep into my bones. I huddled in my thin jacket, shivering. Hours crawled by. My eyes strained against the darkness, seeing movement in every shifting shadow. Sleep was impossible. All I could do was wait, wondering what horrors the night might bring, and pray that somehow I'd live to see the dawn. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, I uncurled my stiff limbs and emerged from my makeshift shelter. I was exhausted, hungry, and scared out of my mind, but I knew I had to keep moving. Staying in one place was too risky. I picked a direction and started walking, keeping the rising sun to my left. My plan was to head downhill, hoping to find a stream or river that might lead to civilization. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen, terrified of hearing that inhuman growl again. The forest seemed different in the pale morning light, less threatening, but no less alien. I passed landmarks that looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't tell if I was going in circles or not. My water was almost gone and hunger gnawed at my stomach. As the day wore on, hope began to fade. What if I never found my way out? What if those things found me first? Just as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I heard a sound that made my heart leap. The distant rumble of a car engine. I changed course immediately, stumbling towards the sound of civilization. As I got closer, I could make out what seemed to be a road through the trees. Relief washed over me. Maybe this nightmare was finally ending, but as I approached the edge of the forest, something made me hesitate. Through the thinning trees, I could see a vehicle pulled over on the side of the road. It was the blue pickup truck from the trailhead parking lot. At first, I was overjoyed. Another hiker, someone who could help me. But then I noticed something odd. The truck's headlights were on, even though it was broad daylight. And they weren't normal headlights. They pulsed with a sickly green glow. As I watched, a figure emerged from the driver's side. It moved with that same unnatural gait I'd seen before. My blood ran cold as I realized this wasn't rescue. It was another of those things, and it was looking for me. I dropped to the ground, heart pounding as I tried to process what I was seeing. The creature by the truck wore clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt, but moved with the same jerky, inhuman movements as the one in the woods. Its face was obscured by a hood, but I caught a glimpse of pale, waxy skin. With dawning horror, I realized what I was dealing with. These weren't some undiscovered forest creatures. They were people, or had been once. Something had changed them, warped them into these grotesque parodies of humanity. My mind raced. How many were there? Were they all through these woods? How long had they been hunting people like me? The hiker's parking lot, so inviting and normal, now seemed like a baited trap. I had to get out of here, find real help. But I was trapped between the horrors in the forest and whatever was waiting on that road. As panic threatened to overwhelm me, I forced myself to think. There had to be a way out of this nightmare. I knew I couldn't stay where I was. Sooner or later, one of those things would find me. My only hope was to parallel the road at a safe distance, looking for signs of real civilization. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. Moving as quietly as I could, I began to make my way through the underbrush. Every snap of a twig made me wince. I kept glancing over my shoulder, terrified of seeing one of those twisted figures lurching after me. Progress was agonizingly slow. I had to stop frequently to listen and get my bearings. The road would disappear from view, hidden by the trees, only to reappear again. Each time I caught sight of it, I scanned desperately for normal traffic, but the only vehicle I saw was that evil blue truck. Just as my strength was about to give out, I spotted something that made my heart leap. A legitimate road sign. It was partially obscured by foliage, but I could make out Ranger Station, 2 miles. A real ranger could help me. I just had to make it there alive. As I pushed towards the promised safety of the ranger station, a sound froze me in my tracks. Footsteps, coming fast through the underbrush. I dove behind a fallen log, praying whatever it was wouldn't spot me. To my shock, a very human figure burst into view. It was a woman, probably in her 30s, with wild eyes and clothes torn by branches. She was clearly as terrified as I was. When she saw me, she opened her mouth to scream. I gestured frantically for silence, then whispered, "Please, I'm not one of them." I'm lost too. The fear in her eyes was replaced by desperate hope. "Oh, thank God," she breathed. I thought I was the only one left. Her name was Sarah. She'd been camping with friends when those things attacked their site 2 nights ago. We quickly shared what we knew, piecing together the horrifying situation. But we couldn't linger. Safety was so close, yet still so far away. Sarah and I moved as quickly and quietly as we could towards the ranger station. Having an ally lifted my spirits, but also doubled my fear. Now, I had someone else to worry about, besides myself. We were about a mile from our goal when we heard it, that bone-chilling growl, much closer than before. Sarah's eyes went wide with terror. "Run!" I hissed, grabbing her hand. We crashed through the underbrush, abandoning all attempts at stealth. I could hear them behind us, inhuman sounds getting closer by the second. My lungs burned and branches whipped at my face, but pure adrenaline kept me going. Suddenly, Sarah's hand was torn from mine. I spun to see one of the creatures, all twisted limbs and grotesque features, dragging her back into the shadows. Her scream cut off abruptly. I wanted to help her, but survival instinct took over. I ran, her fate spurring me to even greater speed. The ranger station appeared ahead, a solid wooden building that promised safety. I sprinted towards it, hearing the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer. Just a few more yards, I slammed into the door, frantically working the handle. Locked. I pounded on the wood, screaming for help. No response. With a sinking feeling, I realized the station was abandoned. Spinning around, I saw them emerge from the trees. 3 of the creatures, moving with that terrifying, jerky gait. The one in the lead wore the deer skull mask. In one clawed hand, it held Sarah's bloody jacket. There was nowhere left to run. As they closed in, a strange calm came over me. If this was how it ended, I'd go down fighting. I grabbed a heavy branch from the ground, hefting it like a club. The creatures hesitated, perhaps surprised by my show of defiance. In that moment of confusion, I struck. The branch connected with the lead creature's skull mask with a satisfying crack. It stumbled back, letting out an inhuman shriek. I wish I could say I fought them off heroically, or that help arrived at the last second. The truth is, I don't remember much after that first blow. My next clear memory is waking up in a hospital bed, hooked up to various machines. The official story is that I got lost in the woods and suffered from exposure and dehydration, leading to hallucinations. Search and rescue found me delirious by the abandoned ranger station. They say there's no evidence of the creatures I describe, or of Sarah, but I know what I saw, what I experienced. Sometimes at night, I still hear those inhuman growls. I've tried to warn people, to get the authorities to investigate, but nobody believes me. They just give me that look, half pity, half concern, and suggest I talk to a therapist. I don't go hiking anymore. Can't stand being in the woods. But every time I see a news story about another missing hiker, I wonder, are they still out there? Still hunting? And how long before they decide to leave the forest behind? It was just another Monday at my office in downtown Seattle when I got a text from my college buddy Mike. "Hey Jake, want to go hiking this weekend? Found an awesome trail near Mount Rainier." I hadn't seen Mike in months, and a getaway sounded perfect. "Count me in," I replied, already daydreaming about fresh air and stunning views. As the week dragged on, I found myself constantly checking the weather forecast and browsing REI's website for last-minute gear. By Friday, my backpack was stuffed with trail mix, a first aid kit, and a brand new headlamp. That night, I could barely sleep, excited for our adventure. Saturday morning came, and I threw my gear into my beat-up Subaru. The drive to our meeting spot took me past familiar Seattle landmarks, the Space Needle, Pike Place Market, and on to I-5 South. As the city faded behind me, replaced by towering evergreens, I felt a mix of excitement and a strange unease I couldn't quite place. I pulled into the small parking lot where Mike's red pickup was already waiting. As I stepped out, the crisp mountain air filled my lungs. Mike grinned, tossing me a granola bar. "Ready for this, city boy?" he teased. If only I knew what was waiting for us on that trail, I would have turned back right then and there. We drove another 30 minutes in Mike's truck, winding up narrow mountain roads until we reached a small, gravelly parking area. A weathered wooden sign marked the trailhead, Shadow Creek Trail, 8 miles. The lot was empty except for us, which Mike said was great. We'd have the trail to ourselves. As we shouldered our packs, I noticed how quiet it was. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Mike didn't seem to notice, busy checking his GPS and water supply. "You sure about this trail?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "It looks pretty isolated." Mike laughed, clapping me on the shoulder. "That's the point, man. No tourists, no screaming kids, just us and nature." I forced a smile, pushing down my unease. We snapped a quick selfie by the trailhead sign, 2 grinning idiots with no idea what was coming. Mike posted it to Instagram with the caption, "Adventure Time, had PN, Viking, Mount Rainier." As we started down the pine needle-covered path, the dense forest seemed to swallow us whole. The trees loomed overhead, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the morning sun. I took a deep breath, telling myself to relax and enjoy the hike. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. The first mile was beautiful, I'll give it that. The trail wound through towering Douglas firs and western red cedars, their trunks wider than my car. Shafts of sunlight broke through the canopy, illuminating patches of vibrant moss and delicate ferns. In any other circumstance, I would have been in awe. Mike led the way, pointing out interesting plants and the occasional glimpse of a distant, snow-capped peak. We talked about old times, catching up on jobs and relationships. For a while, I almost forgot my earlier unease. About an hour in, we paused for a water break. That's when I noticed something odd. There were no sounds of wildlife, no chattering squirrels, no woodpeckers, not even the buzz of insects. Just our voices and the crunch of pine needles under our boots. "Hey Mike, you notice how quiet it is?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He cocked his head, listening. "Huh, yeah. Weird. Maybe we scared everything off?" I nodded, not convinced. As we continued hiking, the trail began to narrow and grow steeper. The lush ferns gave way to thorny underbrush that seemed to grab at our clothes. I stumbled on a root, catching myself on a nearby tree. As I pulled my hand away, I noticed something carved into the bark. A crude symbol I didn't recognize. I blinked, and for a second, I could have sworn it was oozing sap that looked disturbingly like blood. We'd been hiking for about 3 hours when I first heard it. A low, guttural sound that was somewhere between a growl and a moan. I froze, grabbing Mike's arm. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, eyes darting around the dense underbrush. Mike frowned, shaking his head. "Hear what?" "Probably just the wind, man." I wanted to believe him, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. We pressed on, but now I was hyper-aware of every snapping twig and rustle of leaves. The forest seemed to press in around us, the trees growing denser and the path narrower. Then I heard it again, louder this time and unmistakably close. It was a sound that didn't belong in nature, a noise that made my stomach churn. Mike heard it too. I saw the color drain from his face. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, all bravado gone. Before I could answer, a flock of crows erupted from a nearby tree, their harsh caws shattering the silence. We both jumped, hearts racing. As the birds' cries faded, the forest fell into an unnatural silence once more. "Maybe we should turn back," I suggested, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Mike hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, good call. This is getting weird." We turned to retrace our steps, but as we did, I could have sworn I saw something move in the shadows just off the trail. Something large and decidedly not animal. As we hurried back the way we came, nothing looked familiar. The trail seemed different, narrower, overgrown, with turns I didn't remember taking. Mike's confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous energy as he checked and rechecked his phone's GPS. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, tapping the screen furiously. "The signal's gone, and none of these landmarks match up." I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The light was fading fast, shadows lengthening around us. Every tree looked the same, every path identical. We were lost. And that realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Okay, let's not panic, I said, trying to convince myself as much as Mike. We just need to find a clearing, maybe get a signal. That's when we heard it again, that unnatural, guttural sound, closer than ever. It was followed by the distinct crack of a branch snapping nearby. We both whirled around, peering into the gloom. "Hello?" Mike called out, his voice shaky. "Is someone there?" Silence answered, but I could feel eyes on us, watching from the darkness between the trees. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "We need to move," I whispered urgently. "Now." We picked up the pace, no longer caring about following the trail. Our only goal was to put distance between us and whatever was out there. As we stumbled through the underbrush, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, driven deeper into the forest by an unseen presence. In our rush to escape whatever was stalking us, we blundered into a small clearing. What we found there stopped us dead in our tracks. Scattered around the area were odd structures, crude stick figures hanging from trees, piles of rocks arranged in unnatural formations, and symbols carved into tree trunks that matched the one I'd seen earlier. "What the hell is this?" Mike whispered, his face pale in the fading light. I shook my head, unable to speak. The air felt thick, oppressive, like Wed stumbled into something ancient and malevolent. As I turned slowly, taking in the scene, my foot caught on something. I looked down and immediately wished I hadn't. Half buried in the leaves was a backpack, torn and stained with what looked horribly like dried blood. With trembling hands, I knelt and unzipped it. Inside was a water bottle, a crumpled map, and a journal. The last entry, scrawled in shaky handwriting, read, "It's here. God help me. It's real, and it's here." Mike was examining one of the stick figures. "Jake," he called, his voice cracking. "You need to see this." I joined him, my blood running cold as I saw what he was pointing at. Woven into the figure was a scrap of fabric from a jacket identical to the one Mike was wearing. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing his arm. "Right now." As we turned to leave, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest, so close it could have been right next to us. Without a word, we ran, crashing through the underbrush, no longer caring about the trail or direction. Our only thought was escape from the nightmare Wed stumbled into. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky in ominous shades of red and purple. Shadows stretched like grasping fingers across the forest floor, and every tree seemed to loom menacingly over us. We'd been running for what felt like hours, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror. Finally, gasping for breath, we stopped to get our bearings. The forest had grown so dense that we could barely see 10 feet in any direction. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and a thin mist was starting to curl around our ankles. "We can't keep running blind," I panted, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need a plan." Mike nodded, his face ghostly pale in the twilight. Maybe if we climb a tree, we can spot some lights, find a way out." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. We chose a tall pine and started to climb. The bark was rough against my hands, and more than once, I nearly lost my grip. About halfway up, I heard Mike gasp. "Jake, look," he hissed, pointing through a gap in the branches. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was a pinprick of light. Hope surged through me. Maybe it was a ranger station or a campsite, somewhere safe. But as we watched, the light began to move, weaving through the trees with an unnatural, flickering motion. Then another appeared, and another. Soon, a dozen lights were dancing in the darkness, surrounding us. "Those aren't flashlights," Mike whispered, his voice trembling. As if in response, that bone-chilling moan echoed through the forest again, closer than ever. We clung to the tree, paralyzed with fear, as the lights began to converge on our position. With the strange lights closing in, we scrambled down the tree, hearts pounding. We needed shelter, somewhere to hide, and fast. As we stumbled through the undergrowth, I spotted a dark opening in a nearby hillside, a cave. "There," I hissed, grabbing Mike's arm and pulling him towards it. We dove into the cave just as the eerie lights reached the tree line. Pressed against the cold, damp stone, we held our breath, praying we hadn't been seen. The cave was pitch black and smelled of wet earth and something else. Something musty and unpleasant that I couldn't quite place. Outside, we could hear movement, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs. Whatever was out there, it was searching for us. I fumbled for my flashlight, but Mike grabbed my wrist. "Don't," he whispered. "They'll see the light." So we sat in total darkness, straining our ears. The sounds outside grew closer, then paused. There was a low, guttural noise, that same moaning growl we'd heard before, but now it sounded almost questioning, as if it was sniffing the air, trying to catch our scent. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My legs cramped from crouching, but I didn't dare move. Finally, mercifully, the noises began to recede. The lights flickered and faded, moving off into the forest. When we were sure they were gone, I clicked on my flashlight, keeping the beam low. What I saw made my blood run cold. The cave walls were covered in crude paintings, stick figures chasing human shapes, scenes of violence and terror that looked disturbingly fresh. "We can't stay here," Mike said, his voice shaking. This is their place." I nodded, swallowing hard. We had to move, had to find a way out of this nightmare forest. But as we turned to leave, my flashlight beam caught something on the cave floor. Fresh footprints, larger than any human foot, leading deeper into the darkness. We crept out of the cave, every sense on high alert. The forest was deathly quiet, no sign of the lights or whatever had been chasing us. But that almost made it worse. The feeling that something could be lurking just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams was unbearable. "Which way?" Mike whispered, scanning the darkness. I was about to suggest we try to find the trail again when we heard it. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind us. We froze, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps drew closer, accompanied by that low, rumbling growl we'd come to dread. Without a word, we started moving, trying to be as quiet as possible while putting distance between us and whatever was following. But it was no use. No matter how fast we went, the footsteps kept pace, always just out of sight, but never far behind. We came to a small stream, the water black in the moonlight. As we paused, trying to decide whether to cross, I saw something that made my heart stop. There, in the soft mud of the bank, was a footprint, massive, with long, claw-like toes. It was fresh, the water still seeping into the impression. "Mike," I breathed, pointing. He saw it too, his face draining of color. That's not possible," he stuttered. The growl came again, closer this time, and filled with a terrible hunger. We looked at each other, terror plain in our eyes, and then we were running again, splashing through the stream and into the darkness beyond. The footsteps behind us broke into a run as well, gaining ground with every stride. Whatever was chasing us, it wasn't human, and it was done playing cat and mouse. The hunt was on. We ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. The creature behind us was getting closer. I could hear its heavy breathing, smell a rank animal odor on the wind. Suddenly, Mike cried out. In the dim moonlight filtering through the trees, I saw him stumble and fall. I skidded to a stop, turning back to help him. "My ankle!" he gasped. "I think it's sprained." I reached down to help him up, but froze as a twig snapped loudly behind us. Slowly, terrified of what I might see, I turned around. There, not 20 feet away, stood a figure that haunts my nightmares to this day. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, with a massive, shaggy body. Its face was a nightmarish blend of bear and human, with glowing eyes that fixed us with an intelligence that was anything but animal. In one gnarled, clawed hand, it held a crude stone axe. For a moment, that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I could hear Mike whimpering behind me, could feel my own heart threatening to burst from my chest. The creature tilted its head, studying us with those terrifying eyes. Then it opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and let out a roar that shook the very trees around us. The sound galvanized me into action. I hauled Mike to his feet, ignoring his cry of pain, and we ran. Behind us, I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush, gaining on us with every second. We had no chance of outrunning it, not with Mike injured. We needed a plan, and fast, or we were going to die in this godforsaken forest. With the creature hot on our heels, I spotted a steep ravine to our right. It was a desperate move, but our only chance. "This way," I shouted, dragging Mike towards the edge. We half ran, half slid down the steep incline, loose rocks and dirt cascading around us. The monster's roar of frustration echoed above, followed by the sound of it crashing down after us. At the bottom of the ravine, we splashed into a shallow, fast-moving stream. The icy water shocked my system, but there was no time to think. We stumbled forward, using the stream to mask our scent and sound. "There," Mike gasped, pointing to a fallen tree that created a natural bridge across the ravine. We scrambled up the slippery bank and onto the log. As we inched across, I could hear the creature thrashing in the stream below, searching for us. Halfway across, the log shifted ominously. Mike lost his balance, nearly falling. I grabbed his jacket, pulling him back. Just as we reached the other side, I heard a splintering crack. The log was giving way. We leaped for solid ground, the beast's howl of rage following us as the makeshift bridge collapsed into the ravine. We didn't stop running until the sound of the stream faded behind us. Finally, gasping for air, we collapsed against a large boulder. For the moment, we were safe. But we were also lost, injured, and being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. And the night was far from over. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of our situation set in. Mike's ankle was swollen and painful, making it difficult for him to walk. I wasn't much better off. My hands were scraped raw from the climb down the ravine, and a sharp branch had left a deep gash on my forehead. We huddled in the shadow of the boulder, trying to catch our breath and figure out our next move. I pulled out my phone, hoping against hope for a signal. Nothing. "We can't stay here," I said, wiping blood from my eye. "That thing is still out there, and it's not giving up." Mike nodded grimly, his face pale with pain and fear. "It'll slow you down," he said. Maybe you should go on without me." I shook my head firmly. "Not a chance. We're in this together." Using a branch as a makeshift crutch for Mike, we set off again, moving as quietly as we could through the dense underbrush. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound a potential attack. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest around us was unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. Twice, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Our progress was agonizingly slow. Mike's breathing was labored, and I could tell he was in a lot of pain. We were both exhausted, dehydrated, and on the verge of panic. The thought that we might not make it out of this forest alive began to creep into my mind, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. We'd been stumbling through the darkness for what felt like hours when we heard it. That familiar, bone-chilling growl, much too close for comfort. Mike and I froze, straining our ears in the oppressive silence that followed. Then, from somewhere to our left, came the snap of a branch breaking underfoot. Without a word, we started moving again, as fast as Mike's injured ankle would allow. But it wasn't fast enough. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, accompanied by that unnatural, flickering light we'd seen earlier. Whatever was chasing us, it wasn't alone. I could hear multiple sets of footsteps crashing through the underbrush surrounding us. "There," Mike hissed, pointing to a dense thicket of bushes ahead. We dove into the foliage, thorns tearing at our clothes and skin. Huddled in the darkness, we watched as several figures moved past our hiding spot. In the dim, shifting light, I caught glimpses of matted fur, glowing eyes, and stone tools. They were searching for us, communicating with low grunts and gestures. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. Mike was trembling beside me, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I squeezed his arm, silently willing him to stay quiet. For a terrifying moment, one of the creatures paused right in front of our hiding place. It sniffed the air, its grotesque face twisted in a snarl. I held my breath, certain we were about to be discovered. Then, mercifully, it moved on, disappearing into the darkness with its companions. We waited until the sounds of their search faded before daring to move. As we crawled out of the thicket, I realized with growing dread that our ordeal was far from over. Dawn was still hours away, and we were lost in a forest that belonged to monsters. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I spotted something through the trees, a faint, steady light that was different from the eerie glow of our pursuers. As we drew closer, I realized what it was: a cabin. The warm yellow light of a window shone like a beacon in the darkness. "Mike, look," I whispered urgently. "We might be saved." We approached cautiously, wary of another trap. The cabin was small and weathered, but it looked solid and real. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth and safety. As we neared the porch, I saw a battered pickup truck parked nearby. My heart leaped. A way out. I pounded on the door, praying someone would answer. "Hello? Please, we need help." For a long moment, there was silence. Then, the sound of footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, revealing an old man with a weathered face and wary eyes. "What in tarnation are you boys doing out here?" he growled, taking in our battered appearance. "Please, sir," I gasped. "Something's chasing us. We need help." The old man's eyes widened. He glanced past us into the darkness, then quickly ushered us inside, bolting the door behind us. As the warmth of the cabin enveloped us, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly brought me to my tears. We were safe. We'd made it. But as the old man turned to face us, his expression grim, I realized our nightmare wasn't over yet. In fact, we might have just stumbled into something even worse. The old man, who introduced himself as Frank, listened intently as we recounted our harrowing experience. His face grew increasingly grave as we described the creatures chasing us. "You boys have stirred up something that should have been left alone," he said, shaking his head. "Those things out there, they've been in these woods for centuries. Most folks don't believe in them, but I've seen what they can do." Frank explained that he was a former park ranger who'd stayed on after retirement to keep an eye on things. He showed us old newspaper clippings about mysterious disappearances in the area, dating back decades. "They're not just animals," he said. "They're intelligent, organized, and they don't like trespassers." As if to emphasize his point, a bone-chilling howl echoed from somewhere in the forest. Frank's eyes widened in alarm. "They've never come this close before," he muttered, moving to the window. "What I saw next will haunt me for the rest of my life." Surrounding the cabin were dozens of those creatures, their eyes glowing in the darkness. At the forefront stood the largest one, the beast that had chased us earlier. In its hand was Mike's backpack, the one he'd left behind when he fell. Frank turned to us, his face pale. "I'm sorry, boys," he said, "but we can't stay here. They won't stop until they get what they want." As the creatures began to advance on the cabin, I realized with horror that our ordeal was far from over. In fact, the true nightmare was just beginning. I've always loved hiking, especially in the fall, when the leaves turn those brilliant shades of red and gold. This year, I decided to take a solo trip to Glacier National Park in Montana. I'd heard amazing things about the trails there, and I was itching for a real adventure. I spent weeks planning the perfect route, poring over trail maps and park websites. I settled on a 3-day trek through some of the most scenic parts of the park. The weather forecast looked perfect, crisp and clear, with just a hint of that autumn chill in the air. I packed my trusty backpack with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, plenty of trail mix and protein bars, and of course, my water filtration system. I even splurged on a new pair of hiking boots for the occasion. As I drove up to Montana from my home in Seattle, I couldn't shake this feeling of excitement mixed with a touch of nervousness. It would be my first time hiking alone for multiple days, but I felt prepared. I had my satellite phone for emergencies and left my detailed itinerary with my sister back home. Little did I know, as I hummed along to the radio and watched the landscape change outside my window, that this trip would turn into something far different and far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. I pulled into the parking lot at the trailhead just as the sun was peeking over the mountains. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I took a deep breath, savoring the moment. This was exactly what I needed: a break from the hustle and bustle of city life. As I shouldered my backpack and double-checked my supplies, I noticed an older man getting out of his pickup truck. He had a weathered face and a park ranger uniform. "Heading out alone?" he called over to me. I nodded, feeling a bit defensive. "Yeah, I've got a 3-day route planned." He frowned slightly. "Be careful out there. We've had some strange reports lately. Hikers going missing, weird noises at night. Probably just wildlife, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. I was an experienced hiker after all. "Thanks for the heads up," I said with a smile. "I'll keep my eyes open." As I set off down the trail, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the ranger's warning had given me. The forest seemed darker somehow, the shadows deeper. But I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the beautiful scenery around me. This was going to be an amazing trip, I told myself. What could possibly go wrong? The first few hours of my hike were everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound through stunning alpine meadows and dense forests, with breathtaking views of snow-capped peaks in the distance. I felt alive, connected to nature in a way I hadn't experienced in years. But as the day wore on, things started to feel off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. It was just a sense of wrongness, like eyes watching me from the trees. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild after the ranger's warning. Then I started noticing other things. Strange markings carved into tree trunks, not the usual trailblazes, but intricate symbols I'd never seen before. Piles of stones arranged in odd, unnatural formations. And once, I swear, I saw a figure dart between the trees just at the edge of my vision. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The wildlife was acting strange too. The forest was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual bird calls and rustling of small animals. When I did see animals, a deer, a fox, they seemed agitated, almost panicked. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, I realized with a start that I'd covered far less ground than I'd planned. Somehow, the day had slipped away from me. With a growing sense of unease, I started looking for a good spot to set up camp for the night. I woke up the next morning feeling groggy and disoriented. My dreams had been filled with shadowy figures and whispered voices, leaving me feeling more exhausted than when I'd gone to sleep. As I packed up my tent, I tried to shake off the lingering unease and focus on the day ahead. But as I hiked, nothing looked familiar. The trail markers seemed to have disappeared, and my usually reliable GPS was acting up, showing me impossible locations. I tried to backtrack, but the landscape seemed to shift around me. Landmarks I thought I recognized, suddenly unfamiliar. Panic started to set in as I realized I was well and truly lost. The dense canopy overhead made it impossible to get my bearings from the sun. I tried to stay calm, remembering my wilderness training. I had food, water, and shelter. Someone would come looking for me if I didn't check in. But as the day wore on and I wandered in circles, that reassuring voice in my head grew quieter. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming taller, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Shadows deepened, and strange noises echoed in the distance. As night began to fall again, I realized, with growing horror, that I was in serious trouble. I was lost in these woods, and something out there seemed to want me to stay that way. As I stumbled through the darkening forest, desperate to find my way back to the trail, I came across something that made my blood run cold. In a small clearing, I found what looked like an old campsite, but not like any I'd ever seen before. The remnants of a fire pit were surrounded by strange totems made of twisted branches and animal bones. Tattered scraps of clothing hung from the trees, fluttering in the faint breeze. And carved into the trunk of a massive old pine was a symbol, the same intricate design I'd seen on trees along the trail. My hands shaking, I approached the fire pit. Among the ashes, I found something that made my stomach lurch, a partially melted smartphone. As I picked it up, trying to make out any details, I heard a twig snap behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. It was too dark to make out details, but something about its shape seemed wrong, inhuman. As I watched, frozen in terror, it took a step towards me. That broke the spell. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, the forest around me was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, hunted, by something that didn't want me to leave these woods alive. As darkness closed in around me, I knew I had to find shelter. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom and casting long, twisted shadows. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent my heart racing. What was out there in the darkness? I stumbled upon a small outcropping of rocks that formed a shallow cave. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I wedged myself inside, my back pressed against the cold stone. I was too terrified to light a fire, afraid it would attract whatever was out there. As I huddled in the darkness, trying to quiet my ragged breathing, the sounds of the forest changed. The normal nighttime noises, the hoot of an owl, the chirp of crickets, faded away, replaced by something else, something wrong. It started as a low hum, barely audible, but it grew louder, a discordant chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The whispers were inside my head, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but that filled me with dread. And then, cutting through the whispers, came a scream. It was distant, but unmistakably human, filled with terror and pain. I pressed myself further into the cave, shaking uncontrollably. What horrors awaited me in this nightmare forest? The night seemed to stretch on forever. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, real or imagined. The whispers had faded, but the forest was far from silent. Strange, guttural noises echoed through the trees, not quite animal, not quite human. Occasionally, I'd hear what sounded like footsteps, twigs snapping under heavy weight, always seeming to circle my hiding place. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was a voice, calling out in a sing-song tone, come out, wherever you are." The voice was distorted, almost childlike, but with an undercurrent of malice that made my skin crawl. It seemed to be getting closer. I held my breath, pressing myself against the back of the cave, praying whatever it was wouldn't find me. "We just want to play," the voice crooned. "Don't you want to play with us?" Suddenly, a face appeared at the entrance of the cave. In the dim light, I could make out pale, sunken features and eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. A hand, too long and thin to be human, reached towards me. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat. The face twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of sharp teeth. As it lunged forward, I lashed out with my flashlight, connecting with a sickening thud. The creature reeled back, shrieking, and I took my chance. I bolted from the cave, running blindly into the misty dawn. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a heap on the forest floor. As I gasped for breath, I realized the woods around me had changed. The trees were sparser here, and through the thinning fog, I could make out a structure in the distance. Hope surged through me. Maybe it was a ranger station or a hiker's shelter. Maybe I'd finally found my way back to civilization. I approached cautiously, my earlier encounter still fresh in my mind. As I got closer, my heart sank. It wasn't a ranger station, but an old, dilapidated cabin. The windows were boarded up, the door hanging off its hinges. But it was shelter, and right now, that was all that mattered. I crept inside, my flashlight beam cutting through years of dust and cobwebs. The cabin was a single room, furnished with a rusty bed frame, a tilting table, and a pot-bellied stove. But what caught my eye was the wall opposite the door. It was covered in photographs and newspaper clippings, connected by strands of red string. As I moved closer, my breath caught in my throat. The clippings were all about missing hikers, dozens of them, dating back decades, and the photos, they showed the same symbols I'd seen carved into the trees. In the center of it all was a map of the park, with certain areas circled in red. With a jolt, I realized my planned route went right through the largest circle. What had I stumbled into? The cabin felt like a trap, but I knew I couldn't stay there. The wall of missing persons haunted me, each face a grim reminder of the danger I was in. I had to find help, and fast. I scanned the old map on the wall, trying to orient myself. If I was where I thought I was, there should be a ranger station about 5 miles to the east. It was my best shot at survival. I gathered what supplies I could find. Some stale crackers, a rusty canteen, and a box of matches. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Tucked under the bed was an old journal. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed it. Maybe it held some clues about what was happening in these woods. As I stepped outside, the forest seemed different. The mist had cleared, but an unnatural stillness had settled over everything. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. I set off in what I hoped was the right direction, constantly looking over my shoulder. The journal weighed heavily in my pocket, but I didn't dare stop to read it. I had to keep moving. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded, guided by some unseen force. The path seemed too clear, the way too easy. What was waiting for me at the end of this journey? I'd been walking for what felt like hours, the forest growing denser and darker around me. The ranger station had to be close, but doubt was creeping in. What if I'd read the map wrong? What if this was all part of some sick game? That's when I saw him, a man standing in a clearing ahead, his back to me. Relief flooded through me. Finally, another person. Maybe he could help me find my way out of this nightmare. "Hey," I called out, jogging towards him. "I'm lost. Can you help me?" The figure didn't move. As I got closer, I realized something was off. His clothes were outdated, like something from the 1950s, and there was a stillness about him that was deeply unsettling. I slowed my approach, a sense of dread building in my gut. "Sir, are you okay?" Slowly, so slowly, the figure began to turn. I caught a glimpse of a face, pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. A wide, unnatural grin split his features, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. Terror gripped me as I realized this was no man. Whatever it was, let out a bone-chilling laugh and lunged towards me with inhuman speed. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, the creature's laughter echoing behind me. What kind of hell had I wandered into? My lungs burned as I ran, branches whipping at my face and arms. I could hear it behind me, not footsteps, but a sort of skittering sound, like too many legs moving at once. The thing that looked like a man was pursuing me, and it was gaining ground fast. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature had changed. Its limbs had elongated, joints bending at impossible angles. Its face had split open, revealing a maw full of writhing tentacles. Terror gave me a fresh burst of speed. I vaulted over fallen logs, splashed through icy streams, anything to put distance between me and that abomination. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel it getting closer. Suddenly, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I tumbled down a steep slope, rocks and branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and battered. As I struggled to my feet, I realized I'd fallen into some kind of ravine. The skittering sound stopped. I looked up to see the creature perched at the top of the slope, its grotesque form silhouetted against the dim sky. It cocked its head, studying me with glowing eyes. Then, to my horror, it began to climb down, moving with a fluid grace that defied its monstrous appearance. I was trapped, with nowhere left to run. As the creature descended towards me, Time seemed to slow. In that moment of clarity that comes with absolute terror, I remembered the journal I'd taken from the cabin. With shaking hands, I pulled it out and flipped it open. The pages were filled with frantic scribbles, diagrams of the strange symbols I'd seen, and accounts of encounters with something. As I skimmed the entries, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The writer, a park ranger, had been investigating the disappearances. He'd uncovered an ancient evil dwelling in these woods, a shape-shifting entity that fed on fear and suffering. It lured hikers off the trails, toying with them before consuming their essence. But there was more. The entity wasn't alone. It had created servants, twisted mockeries of its victims, to help in its hunts. The man pursuing me wasn't a man at all, but one of these corrupted souls. As I read, I realized with growing dread that the entity didn't just want to kill me. It wanted to make me one of its servants, trapping my soul in these cursed woods forever. I looked up from the journal to see the creature had almost reached the bottom of the ravine. Its form was shifting again, becoming more humanoid, but with an otherworldly grace that sent shivers down my spine. The journal's final pages contained a desperate plan. The ranger had discovered an ancient ritual that could banish the entity, but it required a sacrifice. He had intended to offer himself, but disappeared before he could complete it. I realized with a sickening clarity that I was now in the same position. The choice was clear: become one of these twisted servants, or risk everything on a ritual I barely understood. As the creature's feet touched the ground, its face morphed into a mockery of a human smile. "No more running," it said in a voice like rustling leaves. "It's time to join us." I clutched the journal to my chest, my mind racing. I had one chance to end this nightmare, not just for myself, but for all the lost souls in these woods. But could I find the strength to go through with it? The creature took a step towards me, its arms outstretched in a grotesque parody of an embrace. My heart pounding, I made my decision. I wouldn't go down without a fight. I flipped to the page describing the ritual, trying to memorize the key elements as quickly as I could. "Stay back!" I shouted, fumbling in my pocket for the matches I'd taken from the cabin. The creature paused, tilting its head curiously. "Oh. And what do you think you can do, little morsel?" It hissed, its voice a mix of amusement and hunger. I struck a match, the sudden flare of light making the creature flinch. "This," I said, and began to recite the words I'd read in the journal, my voice shaky but growing stronger with each syllable. The effect was immediate. The creature shrieked, a sound that pierced my skull and made my vision blur. It lunged at me, but an invisible force seemed to hold it back. The air around us began to shimmer and twist. I could hear whispers on the wind, the voices of all those who had been lost to this evil. They were joining me, lending their strength to the ritual. But the entity fought back. Tendrils of darkness lashed out, trying to snuff out my match, to silence my words. I felt a crushing pressure on my chest, making it hard to breathe, let alone speak. As my vision began to darken, I realized with a sinking heart that the ritual required one final component: a willing sacrifice. The ranger had been prepared to give his life. Now, it was my turn. As the realization of what I had to do sank in, a part of me wanted to give up, to let the darkness take me and end this nightmare. But the faces of all those lost hikers flashed through my mind. I couldn't let their suffering be in vain. With the last of my strength, I pressed forward, continuing the chant. Each word felt like fire in my throat, but I forced them out. The creature howled, its form twisting and warping as the ritual took effect. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet began to crumble. A chasm was opening up, glowing with an otherworldly light. I knew instinctively that this was the gateway, the means to banish the entity and its servants. The creature, sensing its defeat, made one last, desperate lunge at me. Its claws raked across my arm, drawing blood. The pain was excruciating, but it also cleared my head. In that moment of clarity, I knew what I had to do. With a final, defiant shout, I completed the ritual. The chasm widened, and I felt myself being pulled towards it. The creature shrieked as it was dragged down, its form dissolving into mist. As I teetered on the edge, time seemed to slow. I saw flashes of my life, my family, my friends, all the experiences I'd never have. But I also saw the faces of those the entity had taken, their eyes filled with hope and gratitude. Taking a deep breath, I closed my eyes and let myself fall. I don't know how long I fell, or what happened in that glowing abyss. My next clear memory is waking up in a hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and worried faces. They told me I'd been found wandering on a trail, dehydrated and delirious, babbling about monsters in the woods. My 3-day hike had turned into a week-long ordeal. Search and rescue had been looking for me for days. As I recovered, I tried to piece together what had happened. How much of it was real, and how much was a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. The wounds on my arm seemed to suggest at least some of it was true, but the doctors had no explanation for the strange, symmetrical scars. In the months that followed, I pored over news reports and park records. There were no more disappearances in Glacier National Park. Whatever had been haunting those woods seemed to be gone. But the nightmares linger. Sometimes, I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can hear whispers in the dark, and I can never shake the feeling that a part of me is still in those woods, forever running from something I can't quite remember. I don't go hiking anymore. The forests that once brought me peace now fill me with dread, because deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, ancient evils that lurk in the shadows, and sometimes the price of confronting them is higher than we can imagine.